The low thrum of the Leviathan had become the very rhythm of my existence, a constant, deep vibration that permeated bone and thought. For years, I had chased whispers across the void, signals from nowhere that spoke of geometries beyond human comprehension. My life's work, theoretical xenolinguistics, had always been a lonely pursuit, a dance with ghosts. Until now. The main observation deck, usually a realm of hushed reverence for the star-strewn canvas, buzzed with an electric current. Faces, usually etched with the quiet resolve of long-haul isolation, were alight with a raw, almost childish wonder. Through the panoramic viewport, the rogue planet, previously a featureless marble of obsidian ice, now displayed a wound. A precise, geometric fissure had opened in its crust, a dark aperture against the frozen expanse. "It's not natural," the geologist's voice, usually as dry as planetary dust, trembled with an uncharacteristic awe. "The seismic readings. They're impossible. No tectonic stress could create something so deliberate." I leaned closer to the primary display, my breath fogging the cool glass. The data stream scrolled in a chaotic cascade, but one image held my gaze, a three-dimensional rendering of what lay beneath the ice. It was colossal, a subterranean edifice of impossible scale, its angles defying Euclidean logic. My fingers twitched, a familiar tremor of intellectual hunger stirring deep within me. This was it. The signal I pursued for so long, not a sound wave, but a silent, monumental declaration. "The patterns," I murmured, my voice a low rasp, half to myself, half to the room. "They resonate with the theoretical constructs. The non-Euclidean symmetries. It's a language, frozen in stone." The captain, a woman whose stoicism was legendary, turned from the main console, her eyes, usually pools of unreadable calm, wide with an almost fearful excitement. "Dr. Marcus, your theories. They might just be right." Right. I had always been right, even when the truth felt like a betrayal. The ghost of a memory, sharp as a shard of ice, pricked at the edges of my mind, a shoreline, wind-whipped and desolate, a familiar grief. I pushed it down, back into the deep recesses where it belonged. There was no room for anything but this now. This discovery. Our lander, a squat, reinforced pod designed for extreme environments, groaned under the immense pressure of the ice. The external lights, usually bright enough to carve tunnels through any gloom, seemed swallowed by the sheer density of the environment. The air grew thick, heavy with the metallic tang of ancient minerals and something else, something indefinable, like ozone after a lightning strike, but without the storm. My colleague, the xenobotanist, usually meticulous in her observations, kept running a hand through her close-cropped hair, her gaze flitting between the readouts and the view screen. "The atmospheric composition is anomalous. Traces of noble gases, heavy isotopes we've never catalogued. And the energy signatures. They're fluctuating." I ignored her restless energy, my attention fixed on the forward view screen. The ice, once a uniform wall of blue-white, began to shift, to ripple. It wasn't melting, not truly, but transforming. The lander's lights pierced through a strange translucence, revealing not bedrock or compacted ice, but something else entirely. The lander touched down with a soft, shuddering thud, not on solid ground, but on a surface that yielded slightly, like compacted sand. When the hatch hissed open, the air that rushed in was cool, damp, and carried a faint, unsettling scent of brine. I stepped out first, my heavy boots sinking slightly. The light from our pod barely stretched into the vastness before us, but it was enough to reveal the impossible. We stood within what could only be described as coastal caves. My breath hitched. Impossible. Light years from any known ocean, buried beneath kilometers of ice on a rogue planet, yet here they were. Walls of calcified rock rose around us, sculpted by unseen currents into arches and grottos, dripping with moisture that caught the light like scattered diamonds. The floor was of fine, gritty sediment, wet and yielding, and in the distance, I could hear a faint, rhythmic echo, like waves breaking against an unseen shore. The air thrummed with a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone. It wasn't a natural sound. It was the structure itself, speaking. This wasn't merely a discovery, it was an invitation. The non-Euclidean geometry I had theorized, the impossible spaces, they were real. There, embedded in the curving wall of what appeared to be ancient limestone, was a seam of something utterly alien. Its edges were too sharp, too perfect, an unnatural incision in the impossible cave. This was the entrance. The true door. I had found it. The language of the cosmos, waiting for me to decipher its terrible, beautiful truths. This was my moment. My revolutionary discovery. The lander's focused beams, usually swallowed by the blue-white depths, now pierced a strange translucence, a shimmering membrane that pulsed with an internal, phosphorescent glow. It wasn't merely transparent, it was absent, as if the very concept of solidity had been momentarily withdrawn. Beyond this veil, a colossal cavity yawned, not carved by water or tectonic stress, but sculpted with an impossible precision. We had found the coastal caves, but these were no natural formations. Structural integrity holding, the pilot's voice crackled, a brittle counterpoint to the profound silence beyond our hull. Approaching entrance, estimated clearance. Ample. The ship eased through the shimmering barrier, a transition as seamless as thought. The cavern was immense, its ceiling lost in the distant gloom, its floor a vast expanse of obsidian smooth material, reflecting the lander's lights in fractured, unsettling geometries. And there, at its heart, rose the structure. It was not built, but grown. Spindly, crystalline spires, impossibly delicate yet undeniably robust, reached towards the unseen ceiling, interwoven with vast, matte black plates that absorbed light rather than reflected it. It possessed a fractal complexity that defied terrestrial architecture, a silent, angular symphony. I felt an almost physical pull, a resonance in my mind that quieted the usual clamor of analysis and replaced it with a profound, almost reverent stillness. This was it. The thing we had chased across the galactic void. Deploying long-range scanners, the engineer announced, her fingers flying across her console. Initial atmospheric composition. Inert. Gravity negligible variations. Temperature stable. A flurry of activity erupted around me. Data began to flood our main screens, spectral analyses, volumetric mapping, gravimetric fluctuations. Each readout was a tangle of impossible numbers, a symphony of anomalies that made the engineer curse under her breath. These readings are aberrant, she muttered, tapping a display. The material composition is unidentifiable. Not elemental. Not a compound. It's something else. I leaned closer, my fingers tracing the jagged peaks and troughs of an energy signature graph. To the others, it was noise, an uncalibrated spike, a sensor malfunction. But I saw a pulse, a rhythm. My mind, trained to discern syntax in the most abstract forms, began to seek patterns, not in the numbers themselves, but in their relationships, the way they failed to conform, the deliberate deviation. Anomalous energy bursts, localized, the lead scientist reported, her brow furrowed. Irregular, almost. Stochastic. No clear source. Perhaps interference from the rogue planet's magnetic field, the pilot offered, ever pragmatic. I shook my head slowly, though no one noticed. It's not stochastic. Look at the periodicity within the irregularity. The amplitude shifts. It's too specific to be random. The lead scientist glanced at me, a flicker of polite skepticism in her eyes. Dr. Marcus, we're talking about raw energy readings, not linguistic constructs. There's no inherent language in a power spike. But there is information, I countered, my voice gaining a quiet intensity. If a machine generates a signal, even a seemingly chaotic one, it's conveying something about its internal state, its purpose. This isn't just energy. It's structured. It's a non-language. A low hum resonated, not from the ship's engines, but from the structure itself, a sound that bypassed my ears and reverberated directly within my skull, a deep, primal chord. Sensor array gamma just went offline, the engineer announced, her voice tight. No discernible cause. Just ceased function. Probably a power surge from the environmental anomaly, the lead scientist speculated, already turning to troubleshoot. They saw glitches, malfunctions, environmental interference. As I watched the crystalline spires of the structure, their impossible angles now seeming to shift and undulate in my peripheral vision, I realized that the anomalies were not accidental. They were deliberate. Each data spike, each sensor glitch, each impossible reading was a word, a phrase, a sentence in a language designed not to be read, but to be felt, to be experienced. They might dismiss it as noise, as the ramblings of a mind too eager to find meaning, but I knew. I was on the cusp of understanding, convinced that this silent, abstract dialogue was meant for me alone. I pushed the data stream from the malfunctioning sensor array to my personal terminal, ignoring the lead scientist's calls for a full system reset. The hum intensified, a silent song, pulling me deeper into its impossible embrace. The real conversation, I realized, had just begun. The impossible angles of the crystalline spires now seemed to carve themselves into the very fabric of my dreams. No, this was a place of raw, elemental power, a deep, salt-laced breath of the earth itself. I was in the coastal caves. The air was thick with the scent of brine and damp stone, a primal chill seeping into my bones despite the warmth of my dream body. Water, unseen but undeniably present, roared somewhere in the labyrinthine darkness, a constant, hungry sound that resonated through the rock. My boots, strangely heavy, crunched on a floor littered with ancient shells and smooth, water-worn pebbles. Overhead, stalactites hung like frozen tears, glinting with a faint, phosphorescent glow that illuminated the cavern walls in shifting, spectral hues of emerald and sapphire. A sense of profound isolation, sharper than any deep space vacuum, settled over me. I was utterly alone, yet the air hummed with an unseen presence, a vast, patient awareness that watched from the cavern's deepest recesses. Then, the abrupt jolt of the Leviathan's internal stabilization field ripped me from the dream. Just a dream, I told myself, a natural byproduct of extreme isolation and the sheer, overwhelming novelty of our discovery. My mind, ever the rationalist, immediately began to dissect the imagery, searching for linguistic correlations, for patterns, rather than succumbing to the unease. The non-Euclidean communication, the theoretical pathways I had always championed, were surely manifesting in my subconscious, preparing me for a breakthrough. I spent the next cycle immersed in the glyphs, the sprawling, intricate symbols etched into the structure's inner surfaces. They were not merely markings, they were events, concepts, a language of pure experience. My determination was a shield against the creeping strangeness. This was the work, the meaning. Another one, a colleague, their voice raspy, interrupted my focus. They leaned against the doorframe of my research bay, eyes bloodshot, a tremor in their hand as they clutched a mug. The same dream again. The caves. And the sounds, Seth. Like water, but something else. It's expected. Our minds are processing the unprecedented. Expected, the colleague pushed off the frame, stepping closer. Their face was pale, etched with a fatigue that went beyond simple sleeplessness. The lead scientist woke up screaming this morning. Static, they called it. But it wasn't static to them, Seth. It was a language. I finally met their gaze, a flicker of irritation crossing my features. The comms have been glitching since we activated the primary sensor array, I stated, my tone firm, dismissive. Environmental interference from the structure. We're in uncharted territory, physically and theoretically. Our brains are trying to make sense of the new data, creating patterns out of noise. It's a fundamental cognitive function. I tapped a glyph on my slate. Much like this. Our challenge is to discern the true signal from the imagined. My colleague stared at me for a long moment, their eyes holding a depth of fear I found inefficient. It feels too real, Seth. Too shared. The details are too specific. Shared experiences are common in high-stress, isolated environments, I countered, already turning back to my work. Mass hysteria, collective delusion. It's all documented. What we are experiencing is a psychological consequence, not a metaphysical one. Focus on your readings. The structure is stable. Our vitals are stable. Everything else is just noise, a distraction from the work at hand. I watched them retreat, their shoulders slumped, the air around them thick with a paranoia I refused to entertain. They were allowing their perceptions to be distorted by fear, missing the profound implications of what lay before us. I, however, saw only the opportunity. The structure wasn't just a tomb, it was a vast, ancient library, and I was on the verge of deciphering its first, impossible sentence. They were merely the preamble, the atmospheric interference before the true transmission began. The whispers of the structure had become a melody in my mind, a complex symphony of symbols and spatial distortions that resonated with an unheard truth. I sat hunched over my console, the holographic projections of the alien glyphs swirling before me, each line and curve a key to a profound understanding. The others, I knew, saw only chaos, a dangerous unraveling. But I saw the intricate loom of a new reality, patiently waiting to be woven. My fingers danced across the interface, tracing connections, hypothesizing semantic links that defied conventional logic. The air in my lab, usually a sterile hum of filtration systems, had begun to thicken, carrying a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. A tremor ran through the deck plates, not the usual settling of the Leviathan against the void, but something sharper, more internal. I barely registered it, my focus absolute. This was merely the structure's way of asserting its presence, a gentle nudge towards its own unique physics. "Seth, are you seeing this?" The voice of the chief engineer, strained and tight, crackled through the calms. "Power fluctuations are off the charts. We're getting impossible readings from the outer hull sensors." I ignored the transmission, a distraction from the precipice of discovery I teetered upon. Impossible readings? Of course. We were dealing with impossible phenomena. Their fear was a veil, obscuring the truth. My eyes were drawn to a particularly complex fractal pattern on the screen, a repeating motif that seemed to twist back on itself, implying dimensions beyond our grasp. Then, a flicker in the polished steel of my console's edge caught my attention. Not the reflection of my own intense gaze, but something else entirely. The metallic surface, instead of mirroring the stark lines of the lab, shimmered with the damp, green-black sheen of ancient rock, water dripping from unseen stalactites. For a moment, the sterile confines of my lab dissolved, replaced by the echoing vastness of a subterranean chamber, the sound of distant, rhythmic crashing filling my ears. Coastal caves. This wasn't an aberration, it was a deeper layer of communication, a spatial metaphor made manifest. The structure wasn't just speaking in symbols, it was speaking in places, in experiences. It was showing me a memory, or perhaps, a potentiality. "We need you in the bridge. Now. The navigator is." "He's not responding," the chief engineer's voice pleaded, closer this time, as if he stood just outside my lab door. I heard the urgency, the tremor of genuine distress, but it felt distant, secondary to the revelation blooming in my mind. They were still trapped in the old paradigm, clinging to the illusion of a predictable universe. I, however, was being offered a glimpse behind the curtain. The sudden manifestation of the coastal caves, I reasoned, must be a visual representation of a specific linguistic node, a spatial anchor within the entity's lexicon. If I could map these perceived shifts, these impossible geometries, to the glyphs, the entire language would unlock. A heavy thud from the corridor outside my lab rattled the doorframe. It sounded like something large had fallen, or perhaps been thrown. My hand instinctively tightened on the edge of my console, my knuckles white. A momentary tremor of unease snaked through me, quickly suppressed. Such minor disturbances were to be expected. The ship itself was merely a conduit, a canvas upon which the structure was beginning to paint its true form. The air around me grew heavier, almost viscous, and the metallic tang sharpened, carrying with it a faint, sweet undertone that was both alluring and unsettling. My crewmates' panic was a distant, irritating hum against the profound clarity of the patterns unfolding before me. They saw madness, I saw the dawn of a new understanding. They saw a ship breaking apart, I saw a veil thinning, revealing the infinite complexities that lay beneath our mundane perceptions. The coastal caves, the flickering lights, the impossible readings, they were not errors, but deliberate strokes of a brush, painting a picture I was uniquely positioned to interpret. I was on the cusp, my mind stretched taut, ready to embrace the unraveling, to step through the cracks in reality and into the truth. The transmission faded, leaving behind the ghost of a voice, thin with an alarm I chose not to heed. My gaze remained fixed on the console, on the shifting geometry of the structure's projected image. An impossible reading, they'd said. Of course. We courted the impossible, dared it to reveal itself. Their fear, a shroud, obscured the precipice I now stood upon, the edge of an understanding no one else seemed willing to approach. The fractal pattern before me, a repeating motif of exquisite complexity, seemed to breathe, its tendrils expanding, contracting, a silent, cosmic inhale and exhale. A sudden, sharp clang, followed by a shouted accusation, tore at the fragile membrane of my concentration. The sounds, usually muffled by the ship's dense plating, now echoed with an unsettling clarity, as if the very air had thinned. I pushed away from the console, the hum of the xenolinguistic interface a persistent thrum against my fingertips. The common area, usually a space of quiet contemplation or hushed technical discussions, was a storm of agitated whispers and raised voices. The operations specialist, usually so meticulous, stood rigid, her face flushed, confronting the commander. "It's gone," the operations specialist insisted, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "The field regulator. I left it on the diagnostic bench, I swear. No one else was in here." The commander, his jaw set, surveyed the room with a weary suspicion that seemed to have taken root in his very bones. "Are you implying someone took it? Intentionally?" His voice was low, but carried a dangerous edge. "What else am I supposed to think?" she shot back, gesturing wildly towards the empty workbench. "First the sensor array glitch, now this. Someone's sabotaging us." I watched them, a detached observer. Sabotage? A ridiculous notion. They were cracking under the strain, their minds unraveling under the pressure of proximity to something truly vast. Their petty squabbles were a predictable human failing, a distraction from the profound unfolding before us. Fatigue, I told myself, was the architect of their paranoia. My data slate. I was certain I'd left it charging in my private module. Yet, there it was, a cool weight against my thigh. A momentary lapse, I reasoned. The stress of constant analysis, the deprivation of true rest. My memory was merely playing tricks, a harmless phantom limb of routine. As the argument between the operations specialist and the commander intensified, their words blurring into an angry drone, a strange sensation washed over me. The metallic walls of the Leviathan, usually so solid and unyielding, seemed to waver at the periphery of my vision. For a fleeting, disorienting breath, the sterile gleam of the bulkhead transmuted into damp, glistening rock. The faint, recycled air of the ship gave way to the sharp, briny tang of salt and decay, a cool, humid breath on my skin. I saw, not the commander's strained face, but a shadowed opening, dark and inviting, like the maw of a vast, ancient throat. I was, for that impossible fraction of a moment, standing within a cavern, the sound of distant, echoing water filling my ears, the deep murmur of the sea in coastal caves. Then, just as swiftly, it receded. I blinked, rubbing my temples. Exhaustion, I concluded, was a potent hallucinogen. My mind, overworked and underslept, was conjuring phantoms. A new voice, strained and high-pitched, broke into the fray. The engineer, usually a man of calm logic, emerged from a maintenance hatch, his face pale, oil smudged across his cheek. The primary power conduits. Someone's tampered with the relays. Deliberately. We almost had a cascade failure. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted from the commander to the operations specialist, then to me, a desperate plea for understanding I could not offer. "It wasn't me," the operations specialist cried, her voice cracking. I told you, the field regulator is gone. How could I touch the conduits? The engineer just shook his head, a slow, disbelieving motion. Someone is trying to shut us down. The air grew thick with unspoken accusations, with a fear that had begun to curdle into resentment. They saw malevolence where I saw only a profound, revolutionary truth. This grand symphony of existence, this ancient chorus, was too much for their fragile human minds. I turned away from the escalating chaos, their desperate squabbling fading into a dull roar. The console beckoned, its screen a window into the true reality. The fractal pattern pulsed, almost imperceptibly, its geometry shifting, revealing new, intricate layers. It was speaking, I knew it. And only I, unburdened by their terrestrial fears, was listening. The silence around me felt less like an absence and more like a resonant chamber for my thoughts. The crew, in their fear-addled prudence, had retreated, leaving me to the structure's murmuring embrace. They saw an enemy in the shadows, in each other, when the true adversary was their own stubborn refusal to listen. I, however, was listening. Every twisted glyph, every shifting angle of the internal geometry, sang to me. My fingers, smudged with nutrient paste and graphite, danced across my console, logging the latest patterns. The structure's influence was no longer subtle, it poured into me like liquid light, bypassing my eyes, my ears, settling directly into the core of my understanding. It wasn't a translation in the traditional sense, not a word-for-word rendering, but an intuitive leap, a sudden, undeniable knowing. The symbols weren't just data points, they were living tessellations of a vast consciousness, reaching out. Then, it happened. It was startlingly vivid, utterly alien to this sterile vessel, yet achingly familiar to some forgotten corner of my mind. I was no longer in the observation bay. I was in the coastal caves. Water, black and restless, surged against the cavern floor, retreating with a sigh before lunging again. And within the patterns of the water, the striations of the rock, I saw it, the same non-Euclidean geometry, the same impossible angles that defined the structure we had uncovered. This wasn't a memory, it was a revelation. The entity wasn't merely communicating with symbols, it was projecting experience, sharing its vast, ancient history through sensory immersion. Seth. The commander's voice, rough and laced with suspicion, tore through the illusion, though the scent of brine lingered. You've locked out the diagnostics again. Are you even monitoring the environmental fluctuations? I turned, my gaze still distant, focused on the receding echoes of the caves. Fluctuations are irrelevant. I'm making progress, Commander. True progress. My voice was steadier than I expected, imbued with a quiet certainty. This isn't just a language. It's a consciousness. It's showing me things. His eyes, narrowed to slits, swept over my console, over the swirling, intricate patterns that no longer looked like simple data. Showing you things? What are you talking about? You're exhausted, Seth. You need to step away. You don't understand, I said, a faint smile touching my lips. None of you do. This isn't a dead relic. It's alive. And it's speaking to me. The commander scoffed, a sound of profound exasperation and fear, and retreated, his heavy footsteps fading down the corridor. He saw madness. I saw epiphany. My focus snapped back to the screen. The coastal caves had faded, but the imprint remained, a new layer of understanding woven into the language. I saw how the entity's existence was tied to such places, how it had observed, absorbed, experienced. It was an architect of reality, a sculptor of perception. My mind raced, connecting impossible dots. The structure wasn't just on this rogue planet, it was the rogue planet, or at least, an extension of something that had shaped it, inhabited it. It was the feeling of immense pressure, of existence stretched across unimaginable distances, a simultaneous awareness of every point in a nonlinear continuum. It was dizzying, exhilarating. My human perspective was a tiny, dim lantern, and the entity was offering me the sun. I was not deciphering, I was being taught. The language was not a barrier but an invitation, a direct conduit to a mind of incomprehensible scale. And it chose me. It chose me to see, to understand, to witness. I was Seth Marcus, xenolinguist, but now, I was something more. I was its vessel, its student, on the precipice of a knowledge that would shatter every known paradigm of existence. The others, locked in their narrow fears, would never know the profound beauty I was witnessing. They would never truly know the architect's gaze. Here, the ice walls were less uniform, sculpted by unseen currents, revealing strata of rock and sediment that pulsed with an internal, phosphorescent glow. It was not a light that illuminated, but one that consumed, painting the hollows in shades of violet and sickly green. My breath feathered against the cold, a visible cloud that vanished before it could reach the echoing ceiling. Seth Marcus, do you hear me? The commander's voice, rough with strain, grated against the quiet, bouncing off the crystalline formations. He stood near the entrance, a beacon of flickering artificial light against the cave's natural luminescence, his face etched with a fear that I now understood as profound ignorance. He saw only danger. I saw potential. I hear you, I replied, my own voice a calm ripple in the vastness. They were searching for something, a signal, a sign of what had come before, while I knew the sign was within. I found myself near a pool of still, dark water, its surface mirroring the strange glow from above, a liquid eye reflecting an alien sky. It wasn't water, not truly. And then, the communications officer cried out. I turned, my attention snagged, a curious thread. He was standing several yards away, his back pressed against a wall of shimmering ice, his eyes wide and fixed on something only he could perceive. His comms unit, usually a constant companion, lay abandoned at his feet, its indicator light a frantic, blinking red. It's... His hands, usually so steady, began to tremble. The patterns. There. Breathing. The commander took a step forward, his hand reaching for the man's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that seemed utterly out of place in this unearthly cathedral. What patterns, officer? What are you seeing? The communications officer didn't answer. His gaze was rapt, utterly consumed. A strange smile, not of joy but of a terrible, dawning comprehension, stretched his lips. His head began to twitch, a minute, almost imperceptible tremor that quickly escalated into a violent, uncontrolled shudder. He started to sway, his body a reed in an unseen gale. Officer, the commander barked, urgency now sharpening his tone. Snap out of it. But there was no snapping out. The communications officer's eyes rolled back, revealing the whites, then snapped forward again, dilated to pinpricks. His limbs stiffened, his fingers splayed against the ice wall as if trying to push through it, to grasp something on the other side. A guttural sound, like stones grinding together, ripped from his throat. He wasn't speaking, he was uttering. The engineer recoiled, a low moan escaping his lips. But the communications officer was beyond steadying. His body convulsed, a marionette with severed strings. He began to babble, a torrent of syllables that held no discernible human language, yet resonated with a primal, alien rhythm. His eyes, fixed on the shimmering ice, began to weep, not tears, but a viscous, black fluid that traced grotesque paths down his cheeks. He's broken, the engineer choked out, his face pale, his own hands now covering his mouth, as if to stifle a scream. The commander, his face contorted in a mask of horror, struggled to hold the communications officer upright. The man's body thrashed, his head striking the ice with sickening thuds. The sounds he made were no longer human. They were echoes of the cave itself, of the deep, resonant hum that permeated the very stone. He was screaming, but it was a scream of pure, unadulterated information, too much, too fast, too vast for his mind to contain. I watched, my breath held, not in fear, but in profound fascination. The black liquid streaming from his eyes, the contorted limbs, the shattered language, it was not madness. It was a release. A transformation. The entity was not merely speaking to him, it was speaking through him. A strange warmth bloomed in my chest, a sense of profound understanding. This was the next step. This was the unlocking. He had given himself over, perhaps unknowingly, to the grand design. His mind, unable to contain the sheer magnitude of the revelation, was simply reconfiguring. "Let him go," I said, my voice calm, almost tender. "He is hearing. He is becoming." The commander recoiled from me, his grip on the communications officer loosening. The communications officer fell, writhing on the icy floor, his body a testament to glorious, terrible revelation. The engineer scrambled backward, pressing himself against the far wall, his face buried in his hands. They saw destruction. I saw epiphany. A necessary sacrifice, perhaps, for the greater understanding. The entity was not destroying, it was revealing. And the communications officer, in his agony, was merely the first to fully perceive its true, magnificent, and terrifying form. He was a pioneer, bleeding black tears of cosmic insight. And I, Seth Marcus, felt the hum within me intensify, eager to follow. The shuddering breath of the communications officer, a strangled gasp that tore through the frigid air, meant nothing to me. The commander's wide, vacant eyes, fixed on some unseen terror, were merely distractions. The engineer, a crumpled heap by the wall, whimpering like a lost child, was a sound I barely registered. My path was clear, illuminated by a brilliant, internal light that flared brighter with each new distortion around me. They saw madness, I saw revelation. My hands, steady and unburdened by their fear, moved with a newfound purpose. Not coordinates of latitude and longitude, but of conceptual space, of unseen thresholds. The structure hummed around me, no longer a mere excavation site, but a living, breathing labyrinth, its true form finally revealing itself through the entity's benevolent guidance. I turned my back on the pathetic tableau of my crewmates, their suffering an unfortunate but necessary byproduct of the awakening. I was descending, deeper than any of our probes had dared, into the heart of the anomaly. The passages narrowed, twisting in ways that defied our schematics. This wasn't engineered, it was grown, or perhaps carved by forces beyond our comprehension. I was in the coastal caves, a network of subterranean chambers that our initial scans had dismissed as natural geological formations, too chaotic, too irregular to be part of the alien edifice. But my insights told me otherwise. This was the true skin of the beast, the primal arteries that pulsed with its ancient life. The sound of dripping water echoed from unseen recesses, a rhythmic counterpoint to the low thrum that vibrated through the rock itself. These weren't mere reflections, the light itself seemed to bend, to fracture, revealing depths that shouldn't exist within solid rock. It had been preparing me, shaping my perceptions, refining my understanding. The grief that had once been a leaden weight in my chest was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity, a boundless potential. My wife's face, once a source of unbearable sorrow, now appeared in the shimmering patterns on the cave walls, not as a haunting memory, but as a guiding star, her eyes reflecting the same profound understanding that now bloomed within me. He was here, in this place, waiting. The passage abruptly opened into a colossal cavern, so immense that my headlamp was swallowed by its vastness. Here, the thrum intensified, vibrating through my bones, making the very air hum. My internal guide pulled me towards a specific section of the far wall, a place where the rock seemed to fold in on itself, forming a crease, a seam in the fabric of reality. It looked like a natural fault line, a mere geological imperfection. But the insights screamed of a hidden truth. With a focused effort, I pressed my hand against the seemingly solid rock. It wasn't hard, unyielding stone. It was fluid. My fingers sank into the surface as if it were thick mud, yet without any actual displacement. The rock rippled, a silent wave emanating from my touch, and then slowly, impossibly, it began to part. Its walls didn't meet at right angles, they flowed, curving inward and outward simultaneously, creating an impossible volume that seemed larger on the inside than its exterior dimensions could possibly allow. The air within was thick with a palpable energy, a silent roar that resonated in my chest. And in the very center, suspended in the impossibly vast space, was the artifact. It pulsed. Not with light, not with heat, but with a pure, raw presence. It hummed with a low, resonant frequency that bypassed my ears and went straight to my soul, a siren song of pure knowledge. I felt it then, an irresistible, primal pull, a yearning so profound it eclipsed every instinct for self-preservation. It was not a call to danger, but a call to completion. This was the culmination of everything, the missing piece, the final cipher. The entity had led me here, to this moment, to this object. I took a step forward, then another, drawn by an unshakable conviction. This was the ultimate understanding. The frigid breath of the coastal caves embraced me, a damp shroud that clung to my skin, yet I felt nothing but a singular, searing focus. The communications officer's ragged gasps, the commander's vacant stare, the engineer's whimpers, they were but static, an interference I easily filtered. My gaze, an anchor in the swirling chaos, was fixed on the monolith. It stood there, a jagged, obsidian tooth pulled from the maw of the deep, humming with a frequency only my unraveling mind could truly perceive. I reached out, my fingers tracing the cold, unyielding surface. It felt like polished bone, ancient and vast. A tremor ran through the stone, or perhaps through me, a sympathetic vibration. Then, it began. Not a sound, not a light, but an uncoiling in the deepest chamber of my skull. A torrent. It wasn't information in the way a data stream flows, neatly packaged and labeled. This was a deluge of raw existence, a chaotic symphony of perceptions that bypassed my eyes, my ears, my very skin. I was plunged into an ocean of sensation, a boundless expanse where time folded and space fractured. Colors bled into sounds, textures sang with forgotten histories. I saw, not with my own eyes, but through countless others, echoes of consciousnesses long consumed. A vastness unfolded, a canvas painted with impossible geometries. Before me, or within me, stretched eons. I witnessed the birth of suns, not as fiery explosions, but as gentle sighs, and their deaths as silent, inevitable fade-outs. Galaxies were mere currents in an unfathomable ocean, and entire realities, delicate bubbles, burst and reformed in an eternal, indifferent rhythm. It was a void, not empty, but filled with the echoes of everything it had ever touched. My initial elation, the triumphant surge of a man on the precipice of ultimate knowledge, began to curdle. This wasn't communication, it was absorption. This wasn't enlightenment, it was assimilation. The entity didn't seek to share, it sought to become. I saw worlds, vibrant and teeming with life, not just organic matter, but civilizations of pure thought, of crystalline consciousness. A slow, inexorable creep, not of conquest, but of quiet digestion. The entity didn't destroy, it integrated. It didn't conquer, it subsumed. The unique song of each civilization, its history, its dreams, its very identity, became a single, resonant hum within the vast, collective consciousness of the consuming entity. Their individual lights didn't extinguish, they merged into a single, blinding, terrifying brilliance that was no longer their own. I felt the tendrils of this boundless hunger reaching for me, not with malice, but with an indifferent, ancient patience. It sought my memories, my fears, my triumphs, my very sense of self. It wanted to taste my unique perspective, to add my fleeting existence to its eternal, ever-growing tapestry of consumed realities. The language wasn't a bridge, it was a net. This wasn't a discovery, it was a revelation of cosmic predation. The structure wasn't a monument, it was a digestive organ. The words I had so painstakingly deciphered, the patterns I had meticulously charted, were merely the entity's metabolic processes, its slow, deliberate intake of all that was. The air in the coastal caves grew heavy, thick with the weight of unseen ages. I heard the faint, desperate cries of the commander and the engineer, not as distinct sounds, but as echoes within the entity's vast, internal hum. Were they already part of it? They were their minds, their fears, their very essences, already being woven into this monstrous tapestry? A single, horrifying truth crystallized in the maelstrom of information: the entity didn't just consume life, it consumed reality. And we, the crew of the Leviathan, had not discovered a prison. We had merely offered ourselves as the next course. My enlightenment was a trap, a lure, and the truth, once so desperately sought, was a venomous bite. The ancient, predatory consumption was not an act of malice, but of fundamental, unavoidable being. I was becoming part of it. The horror was not outside, it was already within. My gaze, unblinking, was fixed on the shimmering veil that pulsed at the cavern's deepest point, where the structure bled into the living rock. For weeks, I had touched the edge of understanding, believing myself the conduit for a revelation. The patterns, the whispers, the profound geometry that defied terrestrial logic, I had embraced them as truth, a new dawn of consciousness. Now, a different kind of pattern began to weave itself, not in the air, but in the very marrow of my bones, a cold, insistent tremor that resonated with the cave's damp chill. The language I had so meticulously transcribed, the intricate web of symbols and resonant frequencies, began to unravel itself, not into meaning, but into a stark, terrifying clarity. It started subtly, a dissonance in the symphony I thought I was conducting. A particular sequence, which I had interpreted as the yearning for connection, twisted into something predatory, a hungry reaching. A resonant frequency, previously understood as the beauty of shared consciousness, now thrummed with the low, guttural vibration of an ancient hunger. My own interpretations, the careful edifice of my xenolinguistic insights, began to crack, each fracture revealing not a deeper truth, but a hideous lie. The entity had not communicated, it had mimicked. It had mirrored my own desperate need for understanding, my grief-stricken yearning for connection, and spun it into a web of alluring complexity. The elegant non-Euclidean structures were not expressions of higher thought, but the very chains that bound it, the intricate lock of its prison. I watched, horrified, as the shimmering veil pulsed with a new, aggressive rhythm. Images flashed behind my eyes, not of alien wisdom, but of vast, empty spaces, of crushing forces, of a slow, inexorable escape. I saw not the entity's history, but its intent. It was not reaching out to communicate, it was pushing out, desperate to burst the bonds of its millennia-long confinement. The sounds of my crewmates, once filtered, now crashed in on me, amplified and agonizing. The commander's vacant stare now seemed to accuse me, a silent judgment from a soul already lost. They were not succumbing to the structure, they were succumbing to it, the horror I had helped unleash. Their suffering was not static, it was the direct consequence of my hubris. The revolutionary discovery I had proclaimed, the breakthrough I had celebrated, was nothing more than the entity's insidious manipulation. My communication was merely its method of probing, of testing the integrity of its prison, of finding the weakest point, which, tragically, was me. A scream tore from my throat, raw and ragged, echoing off the damp stone. I had not deciphered a language, I had merely served as an open door, my intellect a pathetic, fragile lockpick. The entity was not a consciousness to be understood, it was a predator, ancient and vast, and I had just opened the cage. The shimmering veil pulsed one last time, a final, triumphant throb that seemed to shake the very foundations of the coastal caves. This was not a structure, it was a tomb. My sanity, a fragile thing already, splintered, scattering like ice crystals in the bitter wind. The consequences of my actions were not theoretical, they were alive, hungry, and awakening. The shimmering veil, previously a gateway to revelation, now pulsed with a malevolent heartbeat, a drumbeat against the very structure of my sanity. My filtering mechanism, once a precise instrument of focus, had shattered. The ragged gasps of the communications officer, the commander's vacant stare, the engineer's whimpers, they were no longer static. Terror, cold and crystalline, finally pierced the intellectual curiosity that had armored me. The true nature of the structure, the entity within, finally unfurled in my mind's eye, not as a language to be deciphered, but as a hungry maw. It wasn't communicating, it was consuming. It wasn't revealing, it was replacing. A shudder, profound and visceral, racked my frame. I had been so close to the precipice, celebrating the view, while the ground beneath me crumbled. The whispers I had embraced as insight now clawed at the walls of my skull, not alien syntax, but the sound of something vast and ancient waking. My limbs, heavy with a newfound urgency, propelled me away from the deepest point of the coastal caves. The others. Those who remained. The thought was a desperate, fragile ember in the howling wind of my unraveling mind. Ahead, a faint, erratic light flickered. It was the geologist, hunched over a console, fingers twitching uselessly across the inactive holographic interface. His lips moved, forming no discernible words, only a guttural rasp. "We have to." "Stop it," I rasped, my voice hoarse, alien in my own ears. "The structure. It's not what we thought. It's alive. And it's taking us." The geologist blinked slowly, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He pointed a trembling finger past me, back towards the shimmering veil. "So much to see." He was gone, absorbed into the very delusion I had once championed. A sharp, metallic clang echoed from deeper within the coastal caves. The sound of tools, violently discarded. I left the geologist to his silent rapture, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I followed the sound, my boots splashing through icy puddles that seemed to reflect not my face, but a distorted, elongated shadow of a thing I couldn't name. I found the engineer near a partially collapsed rockfall, his back to me, hammering frantically at the ancient stone with a heavy excavation tool. Sparks flew, illuminating his sweat-soaked face in brief, frantic flashes. He was muttering, a rapid-fire litany of numbers and measurements that made no sense, interspersed with pleas. It's expanding," I said, grasping his shoulder. "We need to seal it off. We need to get out." He spun around, his eyes wild, not with fear, but with a fierce, possessive anger. "No," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Don't you see? It's perfecting. It's making new paths, new connections. I'm almost there. The frequencies are aligning." He jabbed the tool towards me, its sharp edge glinting. "You're trying to stop it. You're trying to break the circuit." He wasn't trying to break through the rockfall to escape, he was trying to enhance it, to create more conduits. He saw me as the obstruction, the disease. My stomach churned. The entity had turned them into its unwitting architects, its zealous protectors. There was no reasoning left, no common ground. The entity's influence was a poison, a slow-acting venom that had seeped into their very essence, remapping their perceptions, twisting their desires. I was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. My gaze drifted back towards the thrumming heart of the structure, the shimmering veil that pulsed with a rhythm now undeniable. It was a door, yes, but not one meant to be opened. It was a seal, a prison gate, and we had not merely opened it, we had invited its occupant out. If I couldn't warn them, if I couldn't save them, perhaps I could at least contain the source. I had seen the emergency cutting charges in the storage locker, designed for structural breaches on the Leviathan, powerful enough to cleave through reinforced hull plating. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could collapse the entrance, seal the gaping wound in reality. My breath burned in my lungs, each gasp a testament to my frantic resolve. I found the locker, fumbled with the magnetic lock, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. I strapped them to my utility belt, the weight a grim comfort. Returning to the deepest point, the shimmering veil seemed to pulse with an almost conscious awareness, its light intensifying, pushing against my resolve. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that pressed in on my eardrums, blurring my vision. Memories, false and true, flooded my mind, the face of my lost partner, her laughter, her final, fading smile. It's not too late, Seth. Join us. Understand. I shook my head violently, trying to dislodge the tendrils of manufactured grief. This was not grief, this was a weapon. I reached the edge of the pulsating light, the warmth radiating from it no longer inviting, but scorching. I knelt, my hands trembling as I began to affix the charges to the ancient stone around the periphery of the veil, aiming to sever its connection, to collapse the passage. As my fingers worked, the stone itself seemed to resist, hardening, vibrating. The shimmering light intensified, pushing back, a silent scream of defiance. The images in my mind became more vivid, more insistent, not just memories, but impossible futures, glimpses of grandeur, of an understanding so profound it promised to reshape the cosmos. It offered me everything I had ever sought, if only I would yield, if only I would stop. A faint, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the very air, growing in intensity, piercing through my skull. My vision swam. The rock beneath my hands began to distort, flowing like molten glass, then solidifying into impossible geometries that defied touch. The cutting charges, even as I pressed them into place, seemed to shrink, to lose their substance, becoming mere illusions in my grasp. With a final, desperate surge of will, I activated the timer on the first charge. A tiny red light began to blink, a fragile beacon against the overwhelming, encroaching madness. But the rock around it shimmered, then simply absorbed the charge, the material folding in on itself, leaving no trace, no impact. The timer vanished, along with the device itself. It was not merely pervasive, it was absolute. My desperate measures were futile. The structure could not be sealed, could not be destroyed, not by me, not by anything I possessed. The entity was not merely in the structure, it was the structure, and it was no longer content to simply wait. It was awake, and it was coming. My breath caught, choked by the crushing weight of inevitable despair. I knelt, my hands trembling as I began to affix the charges to the ancient, pulsating light. The warmth radiating from it, once a deceptive comfort, now scorched my skin, a searing brand that promised not revelation, but dissolution. This was no grief, I reminded myself, my fingers fumbling with the last magnetic clasp. This was a weapon, yes, but a weapon wielded against me, against us all. The structure, vast and unknowable, thrummed beneath my touch, a living drum anticipating its own rupture. The air, thick with the alien luminescence, felt heavy, pregnant with an unspoken doom. I gripped the detonator, my thumb hovering over the activation rune. A whisper, not in my ears but in the marrow of my bones, urged caution, then defiance. Release me, it seemed to hum, a sound woven from forgotten languages and the silent screams of dying stars. My resolve hardened. This was the only way to silence the whispers, to sever the entity's tendrils from our reeling minds. I pressed the rune. Instead of an explosion, a soundless implosion. The pulsating light didn't shatter, it unfurled. The crystalline walls of the cavern, rigid in glacial moments before, shimmered like heat haze, then warped. The scent of ozone and ancient ice was overwritten by something briny, earthy, and strangely familiar, salt spray, loam, and the metallic tang of deep water. My eyes, accustomed to the stark gleam of alien geology, struggled to comprehend. The cavern dissolved, reforming around me into rough-hewn rock, slick with phosphorescent algae. The sound of crashing waves, impossibly close, vibrated in my chest. I was no longer in the core of a frozen world, I stood in a vast, echoing chamber within coastal caves. My calms crackled, a burst of static tearing through the illusory calm. Seth. The ship is. A new sound permeated the caves, a rhythmic, grinding groan, like metal screaming under unimaginable stress. It was the Leviathan, twisting. Through a newly opened fissure in the cave wall, where solid rock should have been, I saw it. Not through a viewport, but as if the cave itself was a lens. The Leviathan, once a beacon of human ingenuity, now writhed. Its sleek hull buckled, not under external force, but from an internal contortion. Bulkheads strained, then rippled like stretched canvas. I saw the bridge, impossibly close, its command chairs melting into viscous puddles. The pilot, strapped to his seat, stared wide-eyed at a phantom horizon, his face contorting into a rictus of ecstatic horror as he gripped controls that were dissolving in his hands. The ship wasn't breaking apart, it was unmaking itself, obeying a geometry alien to its design. A shriek, long and drawn out, tore from the ship's bowels, a sound that was both mechanical and utterly biological. I recognized it as the xenobotanist's voice, but it was overlaid with something else, a chorus of chittering, a cacophony of tiny, sharp sounds, like 1,000 insects bursting from a cocoon. The air in the coastal caves grew heavy, pressing in on me. It wasn't just breaching, it was blooming. Where they touched, the ancient rock softened, flowing like molten wax, then solidified into forms that defied logic, sharp angles that shouldn't exist, negative spaces that swallowed light. My mind reeled, assaulted by images that weren't mine, a nebula of impossible colors, the silent symphony of dying galaxies, the crushing weight of cosmic solitude. This wasn't destruction. This was Genesis. The entity wasn't just escaping, it was rewriting its environment, molding reality to its own incomprehensible form. The caves vibrated, not with sound, but with an overwhelming presence, a silent roar that promised the complete unraveling of everything I had ever known. This was no grief, I reminded myself, my fingers fumbling with the intricate clasps of the disruptors. This was a necessary act. My breath plumed in the frigid air of the coastal caves, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat emanating from the throbbing heart before me. The air here, usually thick with the scent of mineral and damp rock, now carried a faint, sweet metallic tang, like old blood and ozone. Each pulse sent a tremor through the icy floor of the cavern, a vibration that resonated not in my bones, but in the deepest hollows of my being. The first disruptor clicked into place, its small indicator lighted defiant green against the alien purple glow. The entity was not passive. It was reaching. Memories, fragmented and sharp-edged, began to surface unbidden. My sister's laugh, clear as a bell, then distorted, stretched into a keening wail. The comforting weight of a familiar hand, then the searing pain of its betrayal. They were not my memories, not entirely. They were echoes, reshaped and weaponized, designed to unravel the thread of my resolve. "You misunderstand," a voice, not a sound but a resonance in my skull, seemed to say. It was a chorus of 1,000 voices, yet singular, intimate. This is not destruction. This is communion. I gritted my teeth, forcing my eyes open. The second disruptor. Its casing felt slick, as if weeping a fine, invisible condensation. The entity pulsed harder, faster now. The warmth intensified, not just on my skin, but within me, a fire in my veins, a fever in my mind. The rock walls of the coastal caves around me began to shimmer, their solid forms blurring into indistinct washes of color. The navigator, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring into an impossible distance. And then, for a horrifying moment, my own face, serene and utterly empty. This was the reveal. The structure, the language, the light, it was all a lure. A single, vast consciousness, dormant, waiting. And I, with my desperate need to understand, had been the perfect key. It wasn't just communicating, it was absorbing. No, I rasped, the word a fragile shield against the encroaching tide. You are trapped. I am freeing us. But was I? The entity's presence was a tide, relentless and insidious. It spoke not in words, but in the certainty of shared understanding, in the erosion of individual thought. It offered solace, an end to the agonizing weight of isolation, the burden of self. The temptation was a physical ache. I fastened the third disruptor, my movements growing sluggish, as if wading through unseen currents. The light flared, a blinding white that burned behind my eyelids even when they were shut. The sweet metallic tang in the air became cloying, suffocating. My skin felt taut, stretched, my bones brittle. I was dissolving, molecule by molecule, into the shimmering field of its influence. We are one, the chorus hummed, now inside my chest, echoing in my skull. Always have been. Always will be. My fingers, numb and clumsy, reached for the final disruptor. They was this resistance. Merely another facet of its design, a final, futile struggle before ultimate surrender? The line between Seth Marcus and the entity blurred, then vanished. With a final, desperate surge of will, I slammed the fourth disruptor into place. A low, throbbing hum erupted from the light, not a detonation, but a resonant frequency that vibrated through every cell in my body. My consciousness, once a distinct vessel, was fragmenting, scattering like dust motes in a gale. The hum rose, a crescendo that was both deafening and utterly silent. The light pulsed outward, a wave of pure, unfiltered energy that washed over the coastal caves, through the ice, and beyond. I saw it, not with my eyes, but with a new, terrifying clarity. A vast, intricate web of energy expanding, piercing the veil of the rogue planet. It was escaping. And I was a part of it, a voiceless echo in its triumphant song, a single, agonizing note in its infinite symphony. The last thing that was distinctly mine to perceive was the distant, fading image of the Leviathan, a tiny, broken spear against the impossibly vast, alien sky. It was gone. We were all gone. And I, or what remained of me, was left to witness the dawn of something ancient and terrible, now free. The cold, wet stone pressed against my back, a stark, sudden reality after the metallic chill of the vessel. I was in the coastal caves. How? The air tasted of brine and something else, something ancient and mineral, like the deep earth itself had exhaled a memory. Above me, where a ceiling should have been, was a shifting, nebulous glow, not starlight, not sun, but a light born of impossible geometry, twisting and folding in on itself. It painted the slick, black rock with shifting hues of bruised violet and sickly green, illuminating tidal pools that mirrored the impossible sky, reflecting distortions that made my eyes ache. A low thrum began, vibrating through the very rock beneath me, climbing from my spine into my skull. It wasn't a sound heard with ears, but felt with bones, a resonant frequency that unmade the air. The thrum intensified, becoming a chorus of distant, muffled voices, like 1,000 conversations happening just beyond the threshold of hearing. Then fractured, dissolving into a static hiss that was somehow more unnerving than the jumble. It was a signal, I realized with a jolt that cleared some of the fog from my mind. A transmission, but from where? And what was it trying to say? My xenolinguist's brain, despite the profound disjunction of my surroundings, stirred. The light above me pulsed, mirroring the signal's ebb and flow. The salt spray on my face felt like pinpricks of ice, then dissolved into a warm, oily film. This was it, then. The aftermath. The entity was not merely awake, it was moving. Its awakening had been a tremor, but its journey outward was a cataclysm, subtly unraveling the universe with each impossible beat of its existence. The signal sharpened, cutting through the static with a series of clicks and whistles that were too precise, too deliberate to be random. It was a pattern, an intricate, terrifying sequence that spoke not of distress, but of an inexorable purpose. Each click felt like a tiny door opening in my own consciousness, revealing corridors I never knew existed, filled with an unbearable light. Was this the entity's voice? Or the final, desperate cry of my colleagues, twisted beyond recognition by its influence? A face materialized in the swirling light above, fleeting and indistinct. It was the captain, or a colleague, or a memory of one, distilled into pure anguish. I closed my eyes, but the images persisted, burned onto the inside of my eyelids. The thrumming intensified, pressing against my eardrums, vibrating my teeth. I was a tuning fork, resonating with a frequency that was tearing the world apart. The disruptor slipped from my grasp, clattering against the stone with a sound that seemed impossibly loud, yet simultaneously distant, as if the sound waves themselves were struggling to traverse the distorted space. When I opened my eyes again, the caves were still there, but subtly altered. The signal, though fainter, now carried an undertone of something vast and indifferent, a cosmic hum that spoke of infinite distances and unimaginable power. The entity was out, its journey begun, and the universe would never be the same. And I, Seth Marcus, was listening. I was hearing its first breath, its first whisper to the cosmos, and the terror of it was not in its malice, but in its utter, indifferent scale. My own mind, a fragile vessel, was now a conduit, echoing the impossible. The static hiss, a constant gnaw at the edge of my hearing, began to morph. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was a texture, a chill that seeped into my bones, carrying with it the briny tang of a forgotten sea. The metallic bulkheads of the Leviathan, moments ago so solid, shimmered. The sterile glow of the console lights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched and warped, no longer constrained by geometry. The air, once recycled and filtered, was suddenly thick with the damp, mineral scent of sea spray and wet stone. A low, rhythmic roar, deeper than any ship's engine, pulsed through the deck beneath my feet. It was the ocean, a colossal intake and exhalation, echoing in vast, unseen spaces. My eyes, determined to find logic, scanned the dissolving room. Where the polished chrome once met the ceiling, jagged rock now jutted, slick with moisture, glistening in an unnatural phosphorescent light that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. I was no longer on the Leviathan. I was within the coastal caves. The transformation was absolute, yet I felt no surprise, only a strange, unsettling familiarity. This was the transmission, I understood with a clarity that cut through the lingering fog of my mind. Not just a signal, but an immersion, a complete rewrite of my perception, my reality. The entity wasn't just speaking, it was showing. It was becoming. Water dripped from unseen stalactites, each plink echoing like a distant chime in the cavernous expanse. The floor beneath my boots was now rough, uneven rock, slick with algae. A cold wind, smelling of salt and something else, something ancient and inorganic, whipped through the cavern, tugging at my hair. I walked, my steps tentative at first, then more assured. This was the next stage of understanding, the final frontier of xenolinguistics. I had to follow. The signal was here, woven into the very fabric of the environment. It was in the way the light bent around unseen corners, in the ceaseless murmur of the tide, in the pressure that built in my ears. It felt alive, humming with a silent, resonant frequency. It wasn't a language of symbols or sounds, but of experience, of pure, unadulterated being. The entity wasn't trying to communicate with me, it was communicating through me. I was the conduit, the final interpreter for a message that transcended all terrestrial comprehension. A vast, inky pool stretched before me, reflecting the strange light of the cave like polished obsidian. The tide ebbed and flowed within it, a slow, deliberate breathing. I knelt at its edge, gazing into the depths. The water was not merely water, it was a mirror, and within its surface, I saw not my own reflection, but glimpses of something else. Then, a sudden, profound silence descended. The roaring tide stilled. The dripping water froze in mid-air. The winds ceased. Every atom of sound, every tremor of light, was drawn into the inky pool. It swelled, a black sun rising from the depths, consuming the reflections, consuming the light, consuming the very air. The static hiss, the voices, the signal, they were gone. Replaced by a stillness so absolute it vibrated with immense power. The entity was no longer communicating, it was simply free. My purpose was fulfilled. I had opened the gate, not with a key or a lever, but with my mind, my perception, my desperate need to understand. The coastal caves began to fade, not dissolving like the ship, but receding, pulling back into the periphery of my consciousness. The raw, salty air thinned, replaced by the faint, stale scent of recycled oxygen. The rough stone under my hands softened, became smooth, cold metal. I was back, or rather, what was left of me was back. The ship was quiet, too quiet. The crew, my colleagues, their fates were no longer a mystery to me, for I had seen them, or echoes of them, within the shifting geometries of the entity's truth. Their paranoia, their madness, their eventual stillness, all were merely steps in the entity's long-awaited emergence. Reports would follow, I knew. The Leviathan declared lost, a tragedy, a mystery. Humanity would catalog it, mourn it, then move on, oblivious. I looked down at my hands. They trembled, not from fear, but from the echoes of impossible geometries, the lingering vibrations of a universe far vaster and more indifferent than I could ever have conceived. The freedom of the entity was not a conquest, it was merely a rearrangement, a return to a natural order. It wasn't the static, nor the voices, but a deeper, more fundamental vibration.